So thanks everyone for coming to today's education session. I'm really happy to introduce my colleague, Kirk Hanson. Kirk's based out of Olympia and has been working with family forest owners and family forests for more than 25 years, both as part of the Department of Natural Resources and as part of the nonprofit Northwest Natural Resource Group. And he's also a instructor at Evergreen State University. So I'm happy to turn it over to you, Kirk, for your presentation, and I'll keep an eye on the chat in case anyone has any questions.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, thanks, Ron. And hello, and thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. I want to start out with a little bit of a disclaimer. The presentation that I'm going to offer you today is not original for this group. A couple of weeks ago, I was invited to speak at the Bainbridge Environmental Conference and put this presentation together for that audience. So some of the references throughout the presentation are going to be fairly specific to Bainbridge, and some of them will be more generalized to the Puget Sound region. But the theme that is a thread through my presentation is really going to be relevant to the entire Puget Sound region, and I'm going to try to make that linkage. But just wanted to give you that context first of all, since again a lot of my references are unique to Bainbridge Island. Excuse me. Let's see. I think just as a matter of protocol, if we can save questions until the very end of the presentation, that'll help with some of the continuity of my talk. And then also, if more people do end up joining midway through, they'll be able to benefit from the question and answers at the very end. So with that, let me see if I can toggle over to my screen or presentation. Okay, and do you have the presentation now on your screen?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, all right, great. All right, well, anyway, again, good morning. And for those of you that just joined, my name is Kirk Hanson, and I'm the Director of Forestry for the Northwest Natural Resource Group. And I've been a consulting forester for a little over 20 years in the Pacific Northwest, and I've specialized in ecologically based forest management for my entire career. I chose this path because it was the way that I was raised. My family owned forest land in Minnesota where I grew up, and my parents were of the Aldo Leopold School of Conservation. You take care of the land, and the land takes care of you. This is Ma and Pa Hanson. I love sharing this photo because I call this or title this photo the original tree huggers. They spent decades planting white pine back across their roughly 80 acres of forest land in Minnesota, planting it beneath the red and white oaks, mostly because white pine was the original old growth across that region. And my parents were very interested in restoring the old growth forests. And white pine dominated that area until a really small, humble family-run logging company called Weyerhaeuser that got started in Wisconsin started logging and basically kind of gnawed their way west until they hit the ocean and then kind of ran out of trees. So my parents were coming in, after that legacy and replanting these trees. This is a white pine that's probably about 40 years old, that at the time that I took the picture was probably about as old as I was. We've since sold that family forest and have reinvested back in Washington. And now between my own immediate family and my parents, we own and manage about 200 acres of forest land and are doing that again in an ecological context. So I've also had the distinct pleasure of helping to build an organization over the past 15 plus years that provides a very unique suite of services to forest owners who are interested in ecologically based approaches to forest management. My organization, the Northwest Natural Resource Group, works with small private woodland owners, conservation groups, land trusts, municipalities, tribes, and many other forest owner types. And I believe that we articulate a middle path of forest management that is between the extremes of preservation on one side and maximum resource extraction on the other side. And the type of people who come to us for assistance are interested in improving wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, watershed hydrology, biodiversity, and sustained timber production. Over the past few years, we've committed our attention to the issue of climate change and understanding how a changing climate will affect forests in our region and how we can manage our forests for resilience in the face of climate change. In my work, I get all over the west side of Washington, and I consult with dozens of forest owners every year. And increasingly, people are expressing concerns about what they're seeing in their forests, primarily tree die-off and declining forest health. I'm also increasingly concerned about what I'm seeing. Cedar, hemlock, grand fir dying off, increased root disease amongst Douglas fir, big leaf maple and madrone going into decline. After witnessing increased die-off in some of their conservation properties on Bainbridge Island, the Bainbridge Island Land Trust has asked me to come and assess the status of their forests and provide some climate adaptation strategies to guide their future stewardship. And so I'm currently working with them right now to develop some forest management plans for a suite of their properties on the island, and those plans likely will be be made available to the public if you're interested in looking at those. And so some of the common questions that keep emerging are, are these, or is this the effect of climate change? These changes that we're seeing in our forest. Are we going to continue to see our region's forests go into decline because of a warming climate and the cascade of effects that result? And then finally, what can we do to help our forests adapt and be more resilient to climate change? So before I make my next statement, I first want to affirm that I believe in the anthropogenic effect on climate change, that humans are dramatically contributing to CO2 levels in our atmosphere that are causing significant and rapid changes to our climate. However, I don't believe that the dramatic changes that we're seeing in our forests are solely attributable to climate change. Although some of the forest health issues we're witnessing are likely exacerbated by the effects of climate change, I instead believe two things. One, much of the mortality we're witnessing in our forests is a natural process that's been in play for decades and is part of the natural successional processes that have shaped our region's forests for millennia. And two, there is another anthropogenic cause behind the forest health issues besetting our region, and that is a lack of proper forest management. We are not taking adequate care of our land. And I would further argue that we are moving from an era of maximum resource extraction to an era of undermanagement, which can result in an entirely different suite of deleterious consequences. So to make my point, I want to bring the conversation down to Bainbridge Island, where I've been working for the past few weeks, and give you some context for the changes that we're witnessing in the forest there today. When Captain Charles Wilkes first visited the island in 1841 on a surveying mission, he documented towering stands of western red cedar and Douglas fir. And it likely wasn't apparent to him at the time that the forest composition on what he eventually named Bainbridge Island was shaped by both regular wildfires and the intentional fires that First Peoples set in order to cultivate the land. The historic fire regime on Bainbridge was classified as moderate to high severity, meaning that high intensity fires burned on the island on a 35 to 100 year return interval. Now, this doesn't mean that the entire island burned, but rather that significant areas of the island burned every 35 to 100 years to such a degree as to dramatically alter forest cover. Now, it's likely that low-lying and wet areas dominated by alder and cedar were spared at times, leading to older and dense stands. Higher and drier sites, however, may have entirely burned or burned all but the largest and most fire-resistant trees, leaving sparsely stocked stands. As is common with disturbed sites on glacial soils, Douglas fir colonized many of these areas in dense and nearly pure stands and grew in a competitive fashion until the next fire. Now, this regular fire regime contributed to a mosaic of stand types and ages across the island, with young, naturally regenerating stands being quite dense, and older stands that were either more fire resistant or had their understory burned out being much sparser. Old growth stumps still remain in many of the forests on Bainbridge, and you'll find these in forests, all across the region. And when you measure the distance between them, you realize that their stocking density, the stocking density of the original old growth, often range from anywhere from just 25 trees per acre to maybe as most as 100 trees per acre, which is in stark contrast to the stands today that often exceed 300 to 400 trees per acre. Now keep that difference in mind as I'm going to return to it. And this is an example of just on a small plot level, the difference in stocking, kind of a visual representation of that. Now, the next thing that we need to understand about Bainbridge is that the island is essentially a large glacial moraine. Soils are comprised of what's generally referred to as Vashon till, and over 60% specifically classified as gravelly loam. That was laid down about 13,000 years ago when the Vashon Glacier retreated from present-day Puget Sound. This glacial till can range from 20 inches to 60 inches deep, and beneath this is a restrictive layer of clay or bedrock that prevents groundwater penetration. Now, this results in shallow-rooted trees and is the principal cause of blowdown during winter storm events when the soil is saturated. Now, conversely, glacial till is extremely well-draining and rapidly dries out once the rains taper off, resulting in very droughty conditions come late summer and extreme moisture stress on all vegetation, including trees. Now, these types of droughty, glacially deposited soils are common all over the Puget Sound, and in particular here in Kitsap County, where the glaciers shoved this gravel up onto the shoulders of Puget Sound, or present-day Puget Sound, as that glacier retreated. So let's review how forest composition on Bainbridge and throughout much of Kitsap County has been shaped for eons. A periodic fire and windstorms essentially reset a site by burning or blowing down many of the trees. Douglas fir and a handful of other species then colonize the site at a very high density, and eventually this high density leads to competition-based mortality, competition between individual trees for sunlight and limited soil moisture. Now, stressed trees are also more susceptible to pests and pathogens that further contribute to mortality. Now, these multiple, what we call natural disturbance regimes, thin the forest, resulting in high volumes of standing dead trees or snags and down logs. And this happens until the next fire or windstorm comes along and resets the site, starting the cycle all over again. Now, let's not forget a more recent disturbance regime that resulted in the loss of most of the forest cover on Bainbridge Island and really throughout much of the Puget Sound over an unnaturally short period of time. And think for a moment about what that was. Logging and clearing for agriculture and development. So settlers first began arriving on Bainbridge Island and clearing forests for farming and homesteads shortly after 1855, following the Treaty of Point Elliott, when the native Suquamish people ceded the island over to the Americans. The first mill came to Bainbridge less than 10 years later, in 1863 at Port Blakely, and for a number of years was the largest lumber mill in the world. Now, before that mill closed in the early 1920s, most of Bainbridge and really most of the Puget Sound lowlands have been clear cut, once again resetting the forest. Now, given that replanting was not required by state law until 1946, clear-cut forests were left to naturally regenerate on their own. And consequently, most of the older forests in our area are artifacts of that prior clear-cut logging to feed these large Puget Sound mills. Now, if you go and core trees within these second growth stands, that reveals ages that range from 80 to 120 years of age, finding a lot of these trees across Bainbridge. And that's precisely at the time of the big old growth mills throughout Puget Sound. So therefore, we're living amongst a new generation of forests in our area, forests that naturally regenerated at a very high density and are once again going through a natural mortality-based thinning process as they sort themselves out on the path of natural succession. So let's discuss where we're at right now. Kitsap County is a rapidly urbanizing area. Nearly 300,000 people live within a very dense forest on droughty soils in an ecosystem that is still classified as part of a moderate to high severity fire regime. Forests on drier sites are comprised of Douglas fir, grand fir, big leaf maple, and on wetter sites, western hemlock, red cedar, red alder. On many sites, there's also a moderate rate of natural understory regeneration, tree regeneration, typically of shade-tolerant trees such as hemlock, cedar, grand fir, big leaf maple, that add to the already high stocking density. Now further, a lot of these species are prolific regenerators, casting seed and growing on sites that may not be suitable to their long-term survival, such as alder, cedar, grand fir, hemlock, which all prefer rich, moist soils, seeding onto shallow, droughty glacial till. They don't have much of a shelf life. With these high stocking rates comes a high rate of competition for sunlight and soil moisture, resulting in an increasing rate of mortality. So go walk in the woods and be mindful of cedar and hemlock in particular, and you'll see it dying off on higher and drier sites. Now, given that modern fire suppression and the lack of any meaningful management, you are now witnessing forests that are going through a natural process of thinning themselves, reducing stocking densities through multiple natural mortality pathways. And I would not say that these forests are unhealthy. That's a very loaded and anthropocentric term. But I would say that having a dense human population scattered throughout a fire-prone ecosystem that is loaded with dead and dying trees is kind of problematic. Now let's talk briefly about climate change. Climate models in the Pacific Northwest are predicting that although the average annual precipitation will remain about the same, rainfall will be more concentrated in the winter, and we will experience more severe storm events. This will likely contribute to more blowdown, and additionally, temperatures are expected to rise rapidly and significantly, with summers becoming hotter and drier and longer. And as average summer temperatures increase from 4 to 6 degrees over the next 60 years, we're going to see increased stress on these forests. And all of these factors are beginning to stress an already naturally stressed forest ecosystem. There will be an increase in drought mortality, and stressed trees will also likely be more subject to other natural mortality agents, such as insects and disease. So between fuels building up in our forests, fuels being the dead wood and small diameter material, and longer, hotter summers, the risk of fire increases significantly. All right. Now, before you flee to the relatively fireproof concrete and steel sanctuary of Seattle, let me leave you with a message of hope. There are some very tangible and easily understandable strategies for addressing the situation that we're finding ourselves in, but they all require that we accept one noble truth. We must heed the words of Aldo Leopold and be active stewards of the land. A continued attitude of preservation and non-management is not an option, except for perhaps the most rare and sensitive ecological sites, such as wetlands and very steep slopes. So I want to close by laying out 5 basic silvicultural forest management strategies for improving the resilience of forests in our region. 1, reduce stocking density. Think of every tree in the ground like a straw in a glass of water. But that glass doesn't get refilled very often, especially during our summer months. And competition for soil moisture leads to stress and mortality. The natural process of forest development is for trees to colonize a site at a very high density, 400 plus trees per acre, like I mentioned. Then through various natural mortality agents, such as drought, disease, storm, low intensity fires, etc., they gradually thin themselves out. Recall that old growth stumps often reflect a stocking of large mature trees that range from 25 to 100 trees per acre. So many forests today are currently stocked at over 4 to 10 times their former density, way beyond the long-term carrying capacity of that site. So we should be thinking about proactively, manually thinning forests to reduce the number of straws in the ground, adjust species competition to favor the most suitable trees for the site, and in so doing, reduce stress and increase overall forest resilience. Our second strategy, we need to have the right trees in the right location. Not every tree species is suited to the site it's currently growing on. As I previously mentioned, although some of the very drought intolerant species, such as hemlock and alder, and to a degree cedar, will seed out and regenerate on most soil types, they may not have much of a shelf life on the most droughty and shallow soils. So know your soils and the topographic microclimates. We may do well to begin proactively removing drought intolerant trees from the most marginal sites and favoring Doug fir, maple, madrone, oak, etc. on those drier, a little more punishing environments. Third strategy, we begin shifting from clear cutting to thinning. And if we shift our timber harvest practices in this way, we accomplish several things. 1, we reduce the challenges inherent to reestablishing seedlings on glacial soils, which can include high seedling mortality due to drought and brush competition. We reduce the high evapotranspiration rate of bare soils and young vegetation, thereby maintaining more soil moisture later in summer months. And thirdly, we promote natural regeneration of new cohorts of tree seedlings whose genetics have a higher likelihood of gradually adapting to changing microclimate conditions versus continuously replanting seedlings with offsite genetics. Fourth strategy, maintain older forests. By growing and maintaining older forests, we accomplish at least several things. Older forests and older and bigger trees tend to be more fire resistant than younger forests. Older forests have a lower transpiration rate than younger forests, thereby retaining more soil moisture later into the summer that benefits forest vegetation and late summer stream flows. And finally, older forests are essential to long-term sequestration of atmospheric carbon. The fifth strategy, retaining hardwoods. Hardwoods are very fire resistant as they have a higher moisture content in their wood. They also emit more moisture into the forest environment, thereby increasing humidity and decreasing fire risk. They're also superior at building soil and provide a wide range of wildlife forage and habitat values. So I'm going to leave it at that. If you're interested in learning more about climate adaptation strategies, I recommend that you go to the website for Rowan's and my organization, again, the Northwest Natural Resource Group. The website is nnrg.org. We have an entire section on climate adaptation strategies, including a guidebook for forest practitioners, a wonderful series of video presentations from some workshops that we hosted about 1.5 years ago by our region specialists in both watershed hydrology, forest pathology, silviculture, a wide range of disciplines. So it's a great resource to go into the deep end of the pool about climate adaptation strategies for our forests. So Again, I'll leave it at that, and I hope I've given you a little different perspective on the confluence of climate change, humans on the landscape, and our local forests, and giving you some useful tips for stewarding our forests in our region. And with that, this is the favorite part of my presentation. I'd love to open it up for conversation and see what kind of questions and comments you have.
I think that we can all talk here, perhaps, or you can write it in the chat. I have a question just to begin with. How can we tell how our local forests, like a Banner Forest or a Forest Ridge Park here in Kitsap County, how can we tell if they are being managed correctly?
Well, it's a great question. I think there's going to be a few visual clues to begin with, just walking through the forest. Now, like I said, some degree of mortality is just part of the natural successional process. But if you're seeing mortality in a forest, you want to ask questions why. To what degree is it a natural process? To what degree is that mortality being exacerbated by other vectors? And is that mortality acceptable? Again, we are living now within, obviously, a forested environment, and increased mortality that leads to fuels buildup, which is excessive amount of dead wood, fine branches, dying trees, etc., can be problematic. So again, it kind of comes back to my generic answer. It depends, and it really depends on the objectives of that particular forest. If this is a forest that's entirely meant for recreation, aesthetics, biodiversity, wildlife habitat, a high degree of mortality, may not necessarily be a bad thing. If that mortality leads to trees falling unpredictably on trails or on structures or on cars, there's some issues there on adjacent houses. We need to have some kind of interventions. One way to find out how a forest is being managed is ask that forest owner, do they have a forest management plan? And does that plan reflect the values of the community, in particular if it's a public forest? I would say also that, if you walk into the forest and your first visual clue is, based on my presentation, that, boy, there are a lot of trees here and they're very close together. That forest may be getting set up for some dramatic mortality issues in the near future. We may not be seeing it right now, but again, with the onset of climate change and an increase in all of the stressors on forests, if there is a high stocking density, a high rate of competition within that forest, we're going to see a dramatic increase in mortality. And again, is that mortality something that we can tolerate, or is that going to be an issue? One other clue that I use to understand if a forest is in a highly competitive phase, in other words, all the trees are competing with each other, is when you look at a tree, take a look at the total tree height. Doesn't matter how tall that tree is, doesn't even really matter what species that tree is, but look at the total tree height and how much of that total tree height is still in live green crown. Crown being, the needles, the leaves of the tree. And when you have a lot of trees all densely packed together, and if they are shade intolerant species such as Douglas fir, alder, oak, etc., that live crown is going to begin receding on that tree through shade competition. The lower branches die off, and that live crown gets smaller and smaller. Now, that live crown is the growth engine of the tree. Think of all those needles as solar panels. So the less solar panels, the less live crown, the slower that tree is going to grow. And in fact, what it's going to do is it's going to shift its growth dynamics from putting on diameter growth, basal growth, to primarily putting on height growth as all those trees are competing to get up to the sunlight. So what happens in that kind of situation is you get a stand or a forest that's comprised of numerous very small diameter, very tall trees that are very susceptible to wind throw. And again, in certain situations, that may be just fine. That's a natural disturbance regime. In other situations, that may not be so desirable. And by thinning out those trees, and spacing them more apart, we're going to give more sunlight resources to those crowns, and those crowns can stay more robust. They'll continue to put on good diameter growth. Those trees will be more sturdy, et cetera. Also, if we want those trees to get from smaller trees now, second growth trees, to larger, more fire resistant trees, or the old growth that a lot of us prefer to see out there, one way to accelerate that development is to thin the forest and again give more sunlight, more soil moisture resources to those fewer remaining trees.
Kirk, and it looks like we have a couple of questions in the chat. Beth was asking, our hemlocks are getting root rot and we are taking those near our house down. What kind of tree ought we plant to replace them? The cedars and pines are doing okay.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you almost have an answer inherent in the question there. First, I would have you confirm that it's root rot that's killing the hemlock. It very well could be. There are a number of root diseases that affect hemlock. But if your soils are, again, well draining, or you're on a slope, or you have a very shallow soil, it could be drought. Hemlock and grand fir right now I'm seeing is kind of the canary in the coal mine. And on marginal sites, those trees are dying off all over the region. I do a lot of work up in the San Juans, and talk about a dry microclimate. Again, hemlock, grand fir, cedar for that matter, reseed prolifically all over the place, but they're not really suitable to that site. And I would suspect that historically, low intensity fires would burn through there and kill off a lot of these tender trees. And in the absence of that natural fire regime, we might get a high stocking of hemlock, cedar, grand fir, and eventually they get to a size where the soils will not support them, and they'll start dying off. So the first thing to ask yourself and to find out is, what is your soil type? Because you'll want to match, again, the right tree with the right soil. So at the tail end of your question, you said, well, the cedar and pine are doing well. Cedar can actually, it's sort of a bimodal species. It can do well on some drier sites. It does really well on wetter sites. So if you see cedar doing well in your area on the same soil type, that sounds like a good option. Cedar also tends to be resistant to most root diseases, fungal pathogens. So that's a good option. White pine is very drought tolerant, or most pines are. Short pine, our local lodgepole derivative. Other options could be oak, maple. You'd have to understand, again, if there is an actual fungal pathogen there, I would recommend Douglas fir on a drier site, but Douglas fir is very susceptible to numerous root pathogens and may not be suitable if you know for sure that that's there. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. I have a related question, and that is that this is third growth forest. It's been logged twice already. Would that also contribute to its the hemlocks not doing well?
I don't think by just the fact that it's a third growth forest that would be having a negative effect on the hemlocks. I really think it's going to be soil related. It's likely too dry for whatever reason. Either, again, it's a gravelly soil, or it's a very shallow soil with a hard pan, at a fairly shallow depth beneath the top soil. Hemlock is a really finicky tree. It really likes north-facing slopes. It likes to be down in draws. It likes to be at the lower portion of a slope, down in valley bottoms. Usually does not do well on higher, drier sites.
Thank you.
May I speak? I'm actually a neighbor of Beth, so I live in the same area as she does, and we have several pine trees, tall pine trees that have died. And I think that's pine beetle or something, but because you said something about pine trees were okay, but in our woods, there are a couple that are still in great shape, but like I said, 5 or 6 are tall trees, died in a matter of a couple of years. You could just see them going. And 2 of them, or several of them, are close to the road. So I've talked to the power company because we look at them, we're afraid that the tops are going to come off and land on the lines. And we did have a fire out here just close to where Beth lives, which was really upsetting to all of us to see the woods going. One of our neighbors had quite a bit of woods dying, or burning, I mean.
Well, there definitely are beetles that are specific to pines that could be affecting the tree. They oftentimes will infect a tree if that tree is already stressed.
Okay.
Rarely does a healthy, vigorous tree attract beetles to it. Interestingly, when a tree gets stressed, it emits a signal that attracts beetles to it. It's kind of part of the natural mortality process. Jill had talked about, how trees talk to each other through the mycelial network underground. Well, they also communicate with other species, and I don't know enough about it to articulate exactly how, but they do emit, might be an infrared signal that insects can pick up and will affect those trees. You mentioned that those pines were close to a road. I may want to see if there's been any damage to the roots. If it's a gravel road, it's been recently graded, or there's been any change, compaction or disturbance of those roots can stress the tree and lead to mortality also. And also, quite be honest,
Thank you.
sometimes trees just die. It's, usually, of course, there's a causal factor, but, like anything, sometimes trees just up and die.
Adrian had a question in the comments, and Adrian, if you'd like to unmute, you're welcome to. It was about assisted migration and when choosing. Go ahead, Adrian.
Sure. Hi, Kirk. Thanks for hosting this. I'm the new stewardship manager with the Great Peninsula Conservancy. So.
Oh yeah, great.
Yeah, the question regarding seed stock for replanting. I understand that it's okay to select seed stock from your seed zones to the south. Can you go 1 or 2, or can you just say something about how you choose and you keep a greater percentage of your current seed zone? Yeah, can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, it's a fascinating area of study right now. What Adrian has referred to is a term that we call assisted migration. And it's basically the premise that, okay, in 80 years, let's say, 60 years, 100 years, whatever, the climate in our area is going to be more approximate to a climate further south of us. And there are some great online models for plugging in your specific location and running a certain temporal scale and seeing, what our region will be like. For instance, I think it's 80 years out. One of these models says that the South Puget Sound will have a climate more approximate to Sacramento. Imagine that. So the question is, should we be planting trees right now that are adapted or have the genetics to be adapted to the climate that will be here in 80 years? That's the notion of assisted migration. So we would be acquiring tree seedlings, say from Northern California or as far south as Sacramento, and planting those here now in anticipation of the climate being more compatible to those species at that time. Now, as with any new idea, this is completely conceptual at this point. And NNRG actually is involved in a partnership. It's called the Stossel Creek Project, where we've worked on planting out a variety of different tree species from different, more southern latitudes to see how they do over time. You'll find that information on our website also. The general recommendation is to not, of course, put all your eggs in one basket, but to include a certain percentage, and this may be a small percentage of these seedlings of southern derivation in amongst, again, more of the majority of the seed stock being from your local seed zone. There's been a lot of studies in planting what we refer to as off-site genetics. Weyerhaeuser has done all sorts of experimentation with trying to get Douglas fir to grow faster, of course. And some of those plantations where they hybridize the trees to take on, higher growth rates haven't performed as well. And so we want to be, of course, very careful when we're interweaving genetics from some other climate conditions, soil types, et cetera, and trying to transplant those somewhere else. So I think it's worth it to put in a small percent and then monitor to see how those new genetics actually fare.
I have a question about how our city and county parks are being taken care of. I ask this in particular because they seemingly allowed those snowmobiles and things and motorbikes in our little park that's only 17 acres. That's the Forest Ridge Park, but that's the largest stand here in Bremerton. That's the biggest forest park in Bremerton. And I noticed after that the paths are so much wider, and it does seem to have done some damage, allowing snowmobile, because you can see where they dug it up. It seems to be allowed by our park management people. Are they aware? How do they keep track of it? Or should we as citizens keep on them to do it right?
Well, yeah, again, the answer will depend based on the municipality. I definitely see some public parks that are not managed well. And mostly what I see is just a complete lack of management. I think both within the conservation community and within public forest lands, there have been decades of an attitude of just do nothing. It's better to lock the gate and do nothing and let nature run its course. And again, in some situations, that's justifiable. If you have highly sensitive wetlands or, a rare remnant older forest type, it may be justifiable to do nothing. But like I said, with most of these forests being in their second or even third generation and being an artifact of past mismanagement or planted as a plantation and at a high density expecting to be managed, if we don't manage them, we confront, again, all sorts of potential consequences. So if you're seeing something that's of concern, certainly bring it to the city's attention or county's attention, whoever the case may be. I think one of the most significant issues right now with, or maybe not right now, but with any kind of active management is soil compaction. So this will be true of logging. This will be true of just human footprints, trails in the woods. This is true of anything, any kind of human impact that is going to systematically compress the soils. We talked about the mycelial network, the fungal network that connects trees and plants in the forest. When you compress the soil, you really limit the ability of that mycelial network to distribute nutrients throughout the forest. And that can have, again, all sorts of deleterious impacts. So I don't know if we fully understand the impacts of soil compaction, but that can be very significant, and certainly bring it to the landowner's attention.
Great, thanks. Are there any other questions? I see Diane raising her hand.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. We have a couple of Madrones mixed in with our other things. And I'm gonna guess maybe they're native. I'm not sure but anyway, the leaves are all like dried out, and I've seen this along the different highways and freeways too. So obviously there's some kind of a pest or disease that's getting them.
Stress.
And I don't know whether there's something we can do about it. But what I would like to know is, well, yeah, if you know about that. Also, when you replant your forest lands or whatever you're going to do, there should be a list, and I'm guessing there is, of trees that are either like native trees, but something that is compatible, so you don't have a big mishmash. And I just wondered, is there something that now we have Doug firs and we have white pine and we have cedar. Something that you would recommend, or how to find out what's a good tree to plant for where you are?
Yeah, great questions. Well, let's start with Madrone. Yes, certainly Madrone is native to our area. And yeah, the die-off that you're seeing in Madrone, you're probably seeing the leaves turning brown,
Right.
branches dying, and it's kind of going to slow decline. There is I believe it's a bacterial disease that is affecting Madrone all across our region. And there are some things that you can do to help the trees, individual trees, be a little more resistant to it. And one of the issues with that's exacerbating this is, again, overstocking in our forests. So Madrone really like to grow out in the open. They're kind of like an oak. They like to have lots of airflow around their branches. They like to have lots of direct access to sunlight. And again, in the absence largely of natural fire, you get a lot of other trees that are growing up in amongst the Madrone, especially Douglas fir, which tends to like the same kind of dry soils that Madrone likes. And Douglas fir grows a lot taller. And suddenly that Madrone now is in the understory of this forest. It's getting shaded out, and there's a lack of airflow around those branches and those leaves. And so if we can come in and thin around the Madrone, in essence, release it, give more airflow, more sunlight directly to that tree, will increase its vigor and hopefully its ability to resist that bacterial infection. So that's one thing to do with Madrone. And as far as, what kind of trees and plants to put out, King County has a wonderful website. I believe it's called the King County Native Plant Finder. And it's you can plug in all sorts of different criteria into there: shade, dry soils, low growing plant, wildlife, forage, all these different variables. And it will then produce a list of plants specific to your request. So you can take a look at your environment and say, okay, I know that the soils are dry. I want a tree that can grow then in the shade. Those are your three criteria. Enter those criteria and it'll tell you, what's suitable for your site. And it'll do that all the way down through shrubs and ground covers. It's a fantastic website. So I'd look there. The other, and I see Rowan just put the link in the chat. Section. And the other, of course, is contact your local conservation district. Usually they have biologists that can help you come out for free, walk your property, and give you some advice. Depending if you have more kind of forestry specific questions, or State Department of Natural Resources and our WSU Extension Service have foresters that can come out for free and walk your site. So a lot of great free resources out there to help you understand what's going on in your forest and make some management decisions, even if it's just as simple as, well, what other things can I plant here?
Thank you.
Beth?
I have two more questions. One is, you suggested that we find out what type of soil we have. Is that something that can be found on a map, or do we have to have an expert come and take a look at it?
No, great question. Thanks for asking. One of my favorite tools is something called the Web Soil Survey. and it's an online tool, and it's put together by the Natural Resource Conservation Service. They're what used to be called the Soil Conservation Service. They're a program within the USDA. So you just type in web soil survey or follow Rowan's link in the chat section. And it's an interactive website. You can plug in your street address and it'll take you right to your location. And then it takes a little bit of finagling to kind of figure out how to use it. But there are all sorts of different map overlays that it will provide you and tell you exactly what your soils are and all sorts of different soil attributes. The other thing you can do, and you can also find this through the Web Soil Survey, is every county has a soil survey. It's a book. They don't publish them anymore. They're all online now as a PDF. But if you're in Kitsap County, on the Web Soil Survey, you can find the Kitsap County Soil Survey, download it. And it's a rich, dense volume of information about the soils in the county or the soils specifically at your site, and will give you all sorts of wonderful information on the plants that should be growing there historically, the forest productivity rates, if you're growing timber, suitability for managing those soils for different human uses. Great resource.
Thank you. I'm going to be doing that right away. My other question is, we have about 7 acres of woods here, and it's a lot of little trees. It's third growth, and I'm thinking we need to be thinning out a bunch of trees. Do we take the little ones or the big ones?
Usually at a young age, I recommend taking the little ones, and it's kind of following again that natural process of self-thinning. That when you look at a young stand, you'll see right away, if you just look around at eye level, you'll see that the diameters of the trees are going to vary. Some have a very small diameter, some have a little bit bigger diameter. And again, look at the relationship between the live crown and the diameter of the tree. And you'll usually notice that the smaller the diameter, the smaller the live crown, especially if that tree is suppressed, beneath the canopy of the forest. So that means that tree is already getting shaded out. It's already getting weeded out of the forest. It's being self-thinned. So it's my inclination in a young forest to come in and cut out those trees that are already kind of losing the race, if you will, of natural succession, and release the more vigorous dominant trees to continue growing. You can also look if there's any kind of defect in the tree, and this is more of a timber quality criteria. But if there's some sweep to the tree, if there's a broken top, some storm damage, or a forked top, if you're trying to improve the timber quality in that stand, you cut those quote unquote defective trees out. Some of those, if you're managing for wildlife habitat, you want to leave. Critters will make nests in the fork of a tree. Sometimes you'll see a tree where it's broken off and all the branches have grown out. We call that a platform. And again, raptors like to build nests on there. So some of those defective trees you may want to keep.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I know we're approaching the 1 hour mark, so it looks like we have one more question and then we can probably wrap up after that. Marty was wondering about cottonwoods and whether they soak up too much water.
Well, again, I'm going to say it depends. It depends on, whether or not, first of all, yes, they can soak up a tremendous amount of water in the summertime. It's not uncommon that when you cut cottonwood that it actually spurts water out at you. It's got an incredible hydrologic pull to it. So it's going to depend. If it's in a wetland, no problem. Plenty of water. If it's on a drier site, then yeah, it's going to be very competitive for soil moisture. And cottonwood also tends to be one of those bimodal species where even though it loves growing on really wet sites and on the edges of wetlands, it also can grow on drier sites. But when it's growing on a drier site, it's going to really compete for soil moisture. with the other trees around it. So it's going to get back to your objectives. Do you want cottonwood? It's a great wildlife species, but it's crummy timber if you're growing timber. It's not a good tree to have next to any kind of a house. They're very prone to dropping branches. They can fall over very easily. They grow fast and tall, have a big crown. They can catch the wind and blow over. So I wouldn't encourage you to have cottonwood with any falling distance of a building or a road for that matter. So it really depends on the location and your objectives.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kirk, for sharing your wisdom on a Sunday. Although it's a rainy Sunday, so it's a nice day for being inside learning about trees rather than out amongst them. That was yesterday. That was the day that was nice to be outside. So thank you so much. And I saw Bonner thanked you in the chat as well just before he dropped. And I'll go ahead and stop the recording.